Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. There were no flowers, no trembling hands, and no soft music playing in the background. There was only the steady, relentless drumming of rain against the 50-story glass windows of Vance Holdings. The storm outside hung over the city like a heavy curtain, turning the afternoon sky into a bruised, melancholic gray. Inside the executive boardroom, the silence was absolute, engineered by thick acoustic walls designed to keep the chaos of the world firmly on the outside. Every time lightning flashed over the distant harbor, it illuminated the sharp, geometric lines of the room, casting brief, harsh shadows that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The air conditioning hummed a low, mechanical note that only made the quiet feel heavier. I sat at one end of a massive conference table carved from a single slab of imported black marble. It felt less like a piece of furniture and more like an altar, a cold, unyielding surface where lives were routinely weighed, divided, and sold. The surface was polished to such a high gloss that I could see the faint, pale reflection of my own face staring back at me. I looked tired, but I did not look broken. I refused to look broken. Sitting directly across from me was Christian Vance. He was a man carved from the exact same unforgiving stone as the corporate empire he commanded. He did not fidget. He did not check his watch. He sat perfectly still, his broad shoulders filling out an immaculate, dark-tailored suit that seemed to absorb the dim light of the room. His eyes were dark, calculating, and entirely devoid of warmth. He operated in the absolute zero of corporate efficiency, a space where human emotions were treated as liabilities, and every interaction was a transaction to be optimized. Between us lay the marriage contract ledger. It was a heavy, intimidating document bound in stiff, unyielding black leather. It detailed the exact price of my existence, clause by clinical clause. The gold embossing on the cover caught the sterile overhead light, glittering with a cold authority. Inside, the pages smelled of fresh ink and expensive parchment, the scent of a trap meticulously set and flawlessly executed. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. My father, Arthur Vance, had not been a malicious man, but he had been a profoundly desperate one. He had spent the last decade of his life quietly drowning in historical estate debts, mortgaging the very walls of our modest coastal home to keep his failing business afloat. I could still remember the late nights when I would find him sitting in the dark kitchen, a cold cup of black coffee in front of him, staring blankly at stacks of red-inked notices. The worry had carved deep lines into his face long before his heart finally gave out. When he passed away suddenly, the massive labyrinth of hidden liability collapsed onto my shoulders. The banks had prepared to seize everything, threatening to evict my ailing mother from the only sanctuary she had ever known. Christian's empire had bought that debt in a single afternoon. Now he was collecting his payment. He required a wife, a quiet, compliant shadow, with a respectable, old-world family name to stand beside him at charity galas and soften his ruthless public image. I was not a partner to him. I was a highly effective public relations acquisition. "Read it if you feel it necessary," Christian said. His voice was a low, steady rumble, completely devoid of inflection. It was the voice of a man who already knew the outcome of the game before the pieces were even placed on the board. I looked down at the thick cream pages. I did not need to read the fine print. I already knew the terms. It was a clinical dissection of a human life, reduced to financial indemnities, residential requirements, and behavioral expectations. It outlined the exact duration of my captivity in his world. He slid a pen across the polished black stone. It was a sleek, heavy instrument made of solid platinum, catching the overhead light with a sharp, brilliant gleam. It was a cold, perfectly balanced tool designed for men who signed away rival companies and destroyed livelihoods before their morning coffee. The pen slid smoothly over the marble and stopped exactly 1 inch from the edge of the leather folder. "Sign," he instructed softly. I looked at the platinum pen. I did not touch it. Instead, I reached for the frayed brass latch of my modest handbag. My fingers bypassed the few practical items I owned and extracted my father's old, worn wooden fountain pen. The barrel was made of dark mahogany, severely scratched in places, the protective lacquer worn away from years of my father's anxious gripping. It smelled faintly of the cedarwood desk, where he used to write his endless, futile appeals to the bank. It was a humble, highly imperfect thing, entirely out of place in this temple of sterile wealth. As I uncapped it, a small, stubborn drop of dark blue ink leaked from the nib and smudged directly against the side of my index finger. The sudden imperfection in this flawlessly curated, multi-million-dollar room felt incredibly loud. Christian watched me. His dark eyes instantly tracked the stain on my skin. The silence in the room shifted, growing heavier. He expected me to apologize. He expected me to reach hastily for a tissue, to blush, to feel a deep, humiliating embarrassment for my own clumsiness in the face of his immaculate perfection. He expected the natural capitulation of a desperate woman. I did not rush. I set the wooden pen down carefully on the edge of the leather folder. I reached into the pocket of my wool coat and pulled out a simple, neatly folded cotton handkerchief. Slowly, methodically, I began to wipe the ink from my skin. I traced the rough grain of the fabric over the blue stain, letting the silence stretch and expand, allowing it to fill the vast, echoing corners of the boardroom. I did not break eye contact with him as I cleaned my hand. The rain continued to beat against the thick, soundproof glass, a steady, rhythmic drumming that perfectly matched the slow, deliberate pace of my breathing. Only when my skin was entirely clean did I fold the handkerchief and place it back into my pocket. I picked up the wooden pen once more. I pressed the steel nib to the thick, textured parchment of the final signature page. The scratch of the metal was a jagged, raw sound in the quiet room. I signed my name in slow, deliberate strokes. Elizabeth Vance. I capped the pen. I did not slide the ledger back across the table. I left it exactly where it was, forcing him to reach forward and take it himself. Christian's gaze remained fixed on my face. I could feel him analyzing the absolute lack of trembling in my hands, searching for the tears that usually accompanied his victims. He found nothing but quiet stone. He reached forward and picked up the ledger, his broad shoulders shifting slightly under his suit. "You are highly pragmatic," he observed. It was not a compliment. It was an inventory assessment. I met his gaze directly, refusing to shrink backward into the heavy leather chair. "You bought my father's debt, Mr. Vance. You did not buy me." The silence between us instantly hardened. It grew teeth. He did not reply, but a microscopic tightening in his square jaw told me he had heard the boundary I had just carved into the marble between us. An hour later, the tinted windows of his heavy, armored town car separated us from the damp gray reality of the city streets. The drive was completely wordless. The leather seats were stiff and smelled of new money and chemical polish. Outside, the city blurred into streaks of neon and gray rain, the rhythmic swipe of the windshield wipers measuring the heavy minutes of our shared isolation. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the glass, refusing to look at his reflection, tracing the cold droplets as they raced down the window pane. We were transported smoothly and silently to his residence, an imposing glass tower that pierced the lowest layer of the storm clouds. The private elevator ascended with such terrifying speed that my ears popped, the doors eventually sliding open to reveal a sprawling, two-story modern penthouse. Stepping inside was like walking into a high-altitude vacuum. The air was heavily chilled and mechanically filtered, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive cleaners. There was no dust. There was no warmth. There was no history embedded in the walls. It was a museum of sterile luxury, entirely composed of white marble floors, vast glass walls overlooking the gray skyline, and brutalist brushed steel fixtures. Every surface seemed designed to reflect power rather than offer comfort. The ambient lighting was hidden in the sharp recesses of the ceiling, casting a pale, clinical glow that made me feel as if I had stepped into an empty gallery. In the center of the massive echoing foyer sat a towering mountain of sleek black cardboard boxes, each one meticulously tied with a silver silk ribbon. Through the semi-translucent wrapping of some, I could see the discreet logos of exclusive European design houses. Designer clothes, rare perfumes, and leather shoes crafted in Parisian ateliers. Christian's personal assistant stood nearby, gesturing to the pile with a practiced, professional smile, referring to them as my welcome gifts. Christian stood by the panoramic floor-to-ceiling window, his back turned to me. He watched the sprawling city below, with his hands clasped behind his back, looking exactly as if he were counting the structural steel. of the buildings he owned. He fully expected me to open the boxes. He anticipated the gasp of gratitude, the wide-eyed awe, the eager submission of a woman raised in a drafty coastal home who had just been handed the glittering keys to an empire. I looked at the boxes. The silver silk ribbons caught the recessed overhead lighting, shimmering with an icy, metallic brilliance. I walked right past them. I did not let my fingers brush the velvet trimmings, nor did I pause to inspect the glossy cardboard. I was carrying a single battered cardboard box in my own arms. It was heavy, its corners severely dented, sealed tight with yellowing packing tape. The assistant stepped forward, offering to take it from me, her hands hovering nervously. I shook my head, offering her a polite, unyielding smile, and held the box closer to my chest. I asked her, in a quiet, even voice, to point me toward the guest suite. I specifically requested the smallest one available. By the window, Christian turned his head slightly, his dark brow furrowed as his brain registered my physical trajectory. The master suite, a cavernous space of dark wood and luxury, lay down the wide left corridor. I turned sharply to the right, walking down a narrow, brightly lit hallway toward the far end of the penthouse. The guest bedroom was equally sterile. It felt exactly like a high-end, impersonal hotel room, waiting for a weary stranger who would only stay a single night. A massive bed sat in the center, tightly made with stark, blindingly white linen. Against the far wall hung a pristine floating glass shelf unit, entirely empty, reflecting the gray light from the window. I walked to the center of the room and set my box down on the floor. The sound of the thick cardboard hitting the polished hardwood was a dull, hollow thud that echoed softly against the bare walls. Kneeling on the cold floor, I used my fingernails to carefully peel back the stubborn edge of the packing tape. Inside the box, there were no expensive garments, no rare jewels, and no cosmetics. There were only books. They were the last remaining artifacts of a life that had been sold out from under me. They were worn paperback classics, their fragile spines heavily cracked and faded from sunlight. The pages were yellowed and curled at the edges from years of being read and reread by the damp coastal sea. As I opened the flaps of the box, the air in the sterile room was suddenly hit with the scent of vanilla, old paper dust, and the faint, lingering memory of salt air from my childhood home. It was the smell of Sunday afternoons by the fireplace, of my mother reading aloud, while the coastal winds battered the thin windows of our living room. It was the scent of safety. I took them out one by one. I walked over to the cold, floating glass shelf. I systematically began to line them up. The frayed, heavily taped edges of a worn 19th century novel sat starkly against the flawless, icy glass. The cracked spine of a heavy poetry collection was leaned carefully against the brushed steel bracket. I handled each volume with deliberate care, running my fingertips over the embossed titles as if greeting old friends who had somehow survived a shipwreck. The physical act of placing them grounded me. It built an invisible fortress of memory in the middle of his sterile empire. I spent 20 uninterrupted minutes arranging them, making sure the heights and colors created a familiar, comforting pattern. This was how I claimed my space in his world, not by accepting his money, not by tearing into his expensive gifts, but by establishing the quiet, unmovable weight of my own mind. I sensed him before I heard him. Christian appeared in the doorway. His tall, imposing frame blocked the harsh hallway light, casting a long, dark shadow across the hardwood floor that stopped just inches from my feet. His presence seemed to pull all the oxygen from the narrow space. His dark eyes cataloged the chipped edges of the books, the worn cardboard box on the floor, and finally, my unyielding posture. For a man who understood the world strictly through leverage and capital, my meager possessions were an unsolvable equation. He stood in silence, looking first at the row of battered books on the immaculate glass shelf, and then turning his head to look back down the hallway toward the untouched mountain of boxes. Still sitting in the foyer. "You did not open them," he stated. It was not a question. It was a factual observation of a variable that did not align with his highly calculated algorithms. "I have everything I require," I replied. My voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried perfectly in the severe acoustic silence of the room. I reached out and gently smoothed the rough edge of a book cover with my thumb. "I will sleep in this room." I will honor the public terms of the ledger we signed this afternoon. But behind these closed doors, Mr. Vance, I will not wear clothes I did not earn, and I will not pretend this is a home." He stared at me. His dark eyes were entirely unreadable, deep and dangerous like the ocean in the dead of winter. He was a man deeply accustomed to women, who demanded more cars, more diamonds, more access. He had absolutely no defense against a woman who demanded absolutely nothing from him. "As you wish," he finally said. His tone was clipped tight, revealing a faint trace of unfamiliar frustration. He turned sharply and walked away. The sharp, authoritative click of his expensive leather shoes on the marble floor slowly faded down the long hall, leaving a heavy wake of silence behind him. I was finally alone. I walked over and sat on the very edge of the stiff, pristine mattress. The fabric of the duvet cover was incredibly high thread count, but it offered absolutely no warmth. It felt like sitting upon a sheet of freshly fallen snow. I closed my eyes and breathed in the comforting scent of the old paper, radiating from the shelf, wrapping the familiar smell around my shoulders like a heavy winter shield. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. The second month of the marriage contract was defined by a heavy architectural silence. The modern penthouse high above the city did not feel like a shared home. It operated as a highly engineered holding cell, a place where time was measured not in shared moments, but in the sterile ticking of a brushed steel wall clock. I spent my days in the small guest wing, reading my worn paperback books, tracing the familiar cracked spines, and breathing in the faint scent of old paper and salt air that still clung to the pages. Outside my closed door, Christian moved through the vast marble corridors like a shadow cast by a storm, quiet, absolute, and entirely inaccessible. Our first public appearance together was a charity gala hosted by his family's philanthropic foundation. It was meant to be a calculated debut of his quiet, compliant new asset. The stylist had selected a floor-length gown of heavy midnight blue silk. It was flawlessly tailored, molding to my frame like a suit of armor. When Christian handed me a velvet box containing a sprawling diamond necklace before we left, I quietly closed the lid and pushed it back across the glass table. I chose to wear nothing on my neck. He stared at my bare skin for a long, calculating moment, his jaw tightening, but he did not force the issue. The venue was an ancestral ballroom in the heart of the city, dripping with crystal chandeliers and the suffocating scent of rare white orchids. The air was thick with old money, murmured corporate strategies, and the metallic clinking of expensive champagne flutes. I walked beside Christian, my hand resting lightly on the dark, immaculate wool of his suit jacket. He felt like a wall of granite beneath my fingertips. He navigated the crowded room with the terrifying grace of an apex predator, never once breaking his measured stride. We were seated at the central table, a vast expanse of white linen and towering floral arrangements. Directly across from me sat Victoria Vance. She was a matriarch carved from glacial ice, draped in emerald silk and generations of inherited arrogance. Her piercing gray eyes tracked my every movement with the clinical detachment of a jeweler inspecting a flawed stone. Victoria viewed human relationships purely as commercial mergers. To her, my working-class background was not an embarrassment. It was a severe liability on the family ledger. For the first hour, the conversation flowed in a steady stream of market acquisitions. I remained perfectly silent, analyzing the predator-prey dynamics of the table. They spoke in a coded language of wealth, using polite tones to inflict precise wounds. When the main course was cleared, Victoria finally turned her absolute attention to me. The ambient noise lowered instinctively. "Christian tells me you have spent the last few weeks entirely sequestered in the guest wing, Elizabeth." Victoria began, her cultured voice pitching over the background hum. "I suppose the adjustment to a life of actual substance can be quite overwhelming for someone accustomed to so little." I did not flush. I looked directly into her cold eyes. "The adjustment has been entirely manageable, Victoria." She smiled, a thin curving of her lips. "Of course it is. Survival is deeply ingrained in the lower classes. Living entirely at the mercy of the tides, constantly repairing rotting wood, it must breed a certain quaint simplicity of mind." A heavy quiet descended over our section of the table. Christian sat perfectly still beside me, his hands resting on the edge of the table. He was observing me, waiting to see if the asset he had purchased would crack under the pressure. Victoria leaned back, gesturing toward a massive Baroque oil painting behind us. It depicted a violent sea with ragged fishermen, hauling nets onto a dark beach. Much like those poor souls, the matriarch continued with manufactured pity. A simple life, entirely devoid of higher strategic purpose. One cannot expect someone raised in such an environment to suddenly understand the complexities of the Vance Empire. I slowly picked up the starch-stiffened linen napkin, smoothing it out over my knees. I folded it down, aligning the cords with absolute precision. The small act of creating order grounded my rapid heartbeat. I met Victoria's gaze. "You have an exquisite collection of art, Victoria," I said. My voice was quiet, entirely devoid of anger, yet it cut through the silence with surgical precision. "But you are deeply mistaken about the subject of that canvas." Her thin smile faltered. "Excuse me. The painting behind you is not a romanticized depiction of simple fishermen," I continued softly. "It is a late 17th century Dutch piece, illustrating the aftermath of the Siege of Ostend. The figures are not hauling nets for a daily catch. They are pulling salvage from a wrecked blockade runner. They are starving." The surrounding guests stared in stunned silence. "They were not simple people living a quaint life," I told her. "They were surviving a brutal, calculated blockade, engineered by men and women sitting in warm, opulent rooms, much like this one. They were fighting for their lives against an empire that viewed them as nothing more than acceptable losses on a ledger." I let the historical truth hang heavily in the air. There is a profound difference between a simple mind and a mind forced to endure the cruelty of others, I concluded quietly. "I would suggest reading the brass placard on the frame, but I understand that inherited assumptions are often much easier to digest than historical facts." The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria's face went pale, the delicate rouge standing out like a harsh rash. She had absolutely no defense against a quiet, devastatingly polite, intellectual dismantling. The moment I refused to bow my head, that's when everything began. Beside me, Christian shifted. I could feel the heat radiating from him, a sudden spike of energy. He turned his head slowly to look at me, his dark eyes burning with a sharp, unreadable intensity. He stared at my profile, as if the quiet shadow he had purchased had suddenly cast a massive, unyielding silhouette across his world. The ride back to the penthouse was suffocating. The armored town car swallowed the noise of the city, leaving only the rhythmic, heavy thud of the tires against the wet asphalt. Christian sat in the far corner of the leather seat, staring out the darkened window. The physical distance between us was only a matter of feet, but the psychological canyon was immeasurable. Silent Canyon only widened, as the second month bled quietly into the third. Following the gala, the penthouse transformed from a sterile holding cell into an active monument of our unspoken standoff. We existed in a state of suspended animation. Christian buried himself in corporate acquisitions, returning long after the city had gone dark. I sought refuge in my small sanctuary within the guest wing, spending my afternoons brewing a warm chamomile and cedarwood tea blend. The fragrant steam rising against the cold glass windows offered a fragile solace. I would sit on the edge of the stiff mattress and methodically sort through the battered cardboard box of paperback books, breathing in the comforting scent of vanilla and salt air. It was a silent rebellion against the marriage contract ledger that bound me to this empire. He did not mention the gala. I did not offer an apology. But a contract built strictly on leverage can only endure so much unspoken tension. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening in our third month of marriage. A cold New England downpour washed over the city, blurring the street's lights into fractured streaks of gold and red. I was in the cavernous living room when the private elevator doors slid open with a soft mechanical hiss. Christian stepped into the stark marble foyer. He shrugged off his rain-dampened coat, his broad chest rising and falling, with a slow, highly controlled tension. He had not looked at me directly in weeks, but tonight, his dark eyes found mine instantly, locking on with a sharp, unreadable intensity. "You will call my mother in the morning," he commanded. His voice was low, dangerous, and completely stripped of its usual corporate neutrality, echoing sharply off the brushed steel fixtures. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The authority in his tone was absolute. You will offer her a formal apology for your behavior at the table. I looked at him, feeling the cold air conditioning seeping into my long sleeves. I corrected a historical inaccuracy. I did not raise my voice. I did not use profanity. I simply refused to let her use my family's tragedy as a dinner party anecdote. You humiliated her in front of the executive board, he countered, taking a deliberate step toward me, trying to pin me to the wall with sheer presence. It is not about who is right regarding a piece of canvas. It is about, since name, you are my wife. You are a representative of this family, and you will not publicly embarrass its matriarch. I am a representative of a contract, I corrected him quietly, the word tasting like ash. A contract that dictated my presence and my physical relocation. It did not dictate that I become a compliant target for your mother's cruelty. Christian stopped a few feet away from me. The anger radiating from him was palpable, a heavy static charge. His gaze dropped to my empty collarbone, then back to my unyielding eyes. This is how you pay me back, he stated. It was a cold, brutal calculation. I clear. A mountain of historical debt that would have crushed your mother. I place a roof over your head that you could never dream of affording, and you repay me by fracturing my family's public unity. The words struck me with the heavy, blunt force of his absolute truth. He genuinely believed that his vast wealth had purchased the rights to my fundamental dignity. He viewed my quiet self-respect as a flagrant breach of our agreement. I looked around the cavernous, sterile room. I looked at the flawless white marble, the custom steel furniture, the expansive glass windows that offered a god's-eye view of a city I did not belong in. It was a beautiful, multi-million-dollar grave. If I stayed, if I apologized to Victoria to preserve the fragile peace of a man who viewed me strictly as property, I would slowly disappear into a ghost. I looked back at Christian. The commanding anger in his eyes was met with nothing but profound, melancholic peace in mine. I paid you with my presence. Christian, I whispered. The sound of his name felt strange in my mouth, heavy and deeply final. I gave up my home. I gave up my quiet life, but I did not sell you my self-respect. Because some things are simply too expensive for you to buy. I did not wait for his response. I turned away and walked straight down the shadowed hallway leading to the guest wing. My footsteps were steady, unhurried, echoing softly against the marble. This time, he did not try to stop me. Once inside the small, pristine bedroom, I did not hesitate. I moved with calm, mechanical precision, pulling my few original belongings together. I carefully packed the battered cardboard box of paperback books, securing the worn spines that smelled faintly of vanilla and salt air. From the sleek glass nightstand, I picked up Arthur's mahogany fountain pen. I ran my thumb over the scratched, dark wood, the very instrument that had signed the marriage contract ledger and bound me to this sterile empire. It was a piece of my late father, a tangible reminder of where I came from, and it was the only real thing I truly owned. I placed it gently on top of the books. Finally, I opened the closet and slipped on my heavy wool winter coat, letting its rough, familiar texture ground me against the surrounding luxury. I walked back out into the main living area, carrying the battered box in my arms. Christian was standing by the massive, black marble kitchen island, completely motionless. Lying on the polished surface was his dark leather wallet, sitting next to a heavy black titanium credit card he had issued in my name earlier that week. A card I had never once used. I approached the counter. I slowly lifted my left hand. On my ring finger sat the unadorned platinum ring he had placed there during our brief, sterile signing ceremony. It was a heavy, cold circle of metal. It had never felt like a promise. It had only ever felt like a shackle, a shiny reminder of Arthur Vance's historical debts. I reached over with my right hand and gripped the metal. I pulled it free. The physical sensation of the ring sliding off my skin was a profound, immediate release. I placed the unadorned platinum wedding band directly in the center of the black titanium rectangle. I aligned it perfectly, ensuring the silver circle rested exactly in the middle of the dark metal. The faint, sharp clink of the platinum hitting the titanium was the loudest sound in the penthouse. It was the sound of a closing ledger. Christian watched my hands. His posture went entirely rigid. The commanding anger in his face fractured, abruptly replaced by a sudden, stark confusion. He was a man who understood leverage, He understood ultimatums and calculated risks. He did not understand a woman who quietly, deliberately relinquished everything. "What are you doing?" he asked. The dangerous edge in his voice was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, raw uncertainty. I did not answer him. I adjusted the cardboard box in my arms, turned my back on the marble island, and walked straight to the heavy oak front door. I wanted absolutely nothing that had been kept inside this sterile vacuum. I gripped the heavy brushed steel handle of the door and pulled it open. "Elizabeth," he said my name again, but this time it was not a command. It sounded dangerously close to a plea, a sharp crack in his impenetrable armor. I stepped out into the private elevator lobby. I did not look back. I let the heavy oak door swing shut behind me, the mechanical latch clicking into place with absolute finality, sealing him inside his silent, empty museum. Minutes later, I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the ground floor lobby and stepped out onto the wet pavement of the city. The rain was falling in thick, freezing sheets. It instantly soaked into my hair and plastered against my skin, but the heavy wool of my winter coat offered a small, fierce sanctuary against the storm. The cold was shocking. It was brutal, biting, and entirely unforgiving. I closed my eyes and tilted my head up, letting the freezing rain wash over my face, washing away the sterile ozone of the penthouse, washing away the suffocating weight of his empire. The chill seeped deep into my bones, making my hands tremble and my teeth ache. It was freezing. It was painful. But as I opened my eyes and began to walk away from the glass tower, disappearing into the dark, rain-swept streets with my father's books clutched to my chest and absolutely nothing to my name, I took a deep, shuddering breath. For the first time in 3 months, the air felt real. The journey back to the coast was measured in the rhythmic, metal-on-metal clatter of a late-night commuter train. Hours bled slowly into one another. I sat alone in a dimly lit carriage, resting my temple against the scratched, freezing glass of the window. The rain battered the side of the train in violent, chaotic bursts, blurring the neon lights of the city into long, bleeding streaks of red and gold. I hugged the heavy wool of my winter coat tighter around my shoulders. My hands still trembled slightly. Not from the chill of the storm, but from the raw, electric adrenaline of walking away. It was the profound shock of choosing absolute uncertainty over a gilded cage. I watched the towering skyline of the city recede into the darkness. The imposing glass needles of Christian's world shrank. They became nothing more than faint, blurry pinpricks of light. Then, they were swallowed entirely by the heavy New England downpour. By the time the train finally groaned to a halt, at the small coastal station, the rain had softened into a persistent, freezing mist that clung to everything. I stepped out onto the empty, cracked concrete platform with my battered cardboard box of paperback books held firmly against my chest. There was no armored town car waiting for me. There was no personal assistant offering an umbrella, practiced smile. There was only the distant, rhythmic crashing of the ocean against the rocky shoreline, a dark, heavy sound that immediately bypassed my exhaustion and settled deep into my bones. I walked the 2 miles to my childhood home in the dark, my leather shoes soaking through with every step along the muddy, unlit road. The house stood at the end of a winding driveway, flanked by overgrown coastal grass that whipped wildly in the wind. It was a modest, weather-beaten structure with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch, entirely devoid of architectural prestige or modern security. When I pushed the rusted key into the stubborn lock and finally opened the front door, the air inside was stale, smelling heavily of cold fireplace ash, damp earth, and the undeniable absence of life. But it was not sterile. It was not a museum built to showcase cold power. It was mine. I moved through the dark, drafty living room, my footsteps echoing against the bare floorboards, and stepped into the small kitchen. The linoleum floor was peeling at the corners, and the moonlight filtering through the bare window illuminated the worn formica counter. I set the heavy cardboard box down gently, my arms aching from the weight. I reached inside and withdrew Arthur's mahogany fountain pen, laying the scratched, dark wood beside the box. I stood there in the quiet darkness, listening to the creaking of the walls as the house settled against the coastal wind. I was completely alone. I had no financial safety net, no immediate prospects, and no heat to chase away the winter cold. But as I ran my fingertips over the rough edge of the counter, I felt a deep, anchoring peace. I found an old, dented tin hidden in the back of the pantry. I boiled water on the struggling, sputtering gas stove and brewed a cup of chamomile and cedarwood tea blend. I sat at the small kitchen table in the dark, wrapping my freezing, trembling hands around the chipped ceramic mug, letting the fragrant steam rise against my face. The familiar, earthy scent of the cedarwood grounded me, slowly chasing away the lingering ghost of the penthouse's ozone and chemical polish. I sipped the hot tea, and for the first time since my father's sudden death, I did not feel the crushing weight of his historical debts pulling me under. They had been paid in full. The marriage contract ledger was fulfilled. I had bought my freedom, and I had paid for it with the only currency Christian Vesence could not control: my refusal to break. The harsh reality of my situation arrived with the pale, gray light of morning. I woke up shivering under a thin blanket on the living room sofa. I had left the black titanium credit card, sitting on his pristine marble island. I had absolutely no money for groceries, let alone the mounting property taxes that would soon arrive in the mail. Financial desperation usually strips away a person's options, but this time, the choices were entirely my own. I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear of regret. I simply walked to the bathroom, washed my face with freezing tap water, put my heavy wool coat back on, and walked into the village. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. The village was a quiet labyrinth of salt-washed storefronts and narrow, fog-shrouded alleys, and it was there, at the end of a cobblestone street, that I found Clara Miller's independent bookshop. The building was old, its brick facade heavily weathered by decades of ocean storms, and the large front window was fogged with morning condensation. When I pushed the heavy wooden door open, a small brass bell chimed overhead, a bright, delightfully imperfect sound that cut sharply through the coastal gloom. The interior was a warm, dimly lit sanctuary of towering, overcrowded shelves. The air was thick with the scent of vanilla, binding glue, and old paper dust. It was exactly the kind of place Christian's corporate empire was all money at even to build a sleek, soulless parking structure. Clara Miller stood behind the wooden checkout counter. She was an older woman with silver hair pulled into a loose, messy knot, wearing a thick, oversized woolen cardigan. Her eyes were sharp, perceptive, and deeply kind. She looked at me, taking in the damp edges of my coat, the dark circles under my eyes, and the quiet, unyielding set of my jaw. She did not ask about the city. She did not ask why Arthur Vance's daughter had returned looking like a survivor of a brutal shipwreck. She simply offered me a warm, knowing smile and asked if I knew how to properly catalog 19th century literature. By noon, I was officially employed. It was minimum wage, paid entirely under the table in crumpled bills, and it was the most valuable money I had ever earned. My first task was not intellectual, it was highly physical. Clara asked me to restore the shop's older fixtures, starting with the scarred checkout counter and moving to a massive, worn wooden bookshelf in the back corner that had suffered from years of coastal dampness. I spent the entire afternoon kneeling on the creaking floorboards, a coarse rag soaked in raw linseed oil gripped tightly in my hand. I worked the thick, golden oil into the dry, thirsty grain of the old pine. The physical labor was demanding and relentless. My shoulders ached with a sharp, validating pain, and my knuckles grew red and raw from the constant friction. But the repetitive, circular motion was profoundly therapeutic. I was not standing in a crystal-draped ballroom, being casually dissected by Victoria Vance. I was not wearing heavy diamonds that felt like a chokehold. I was not navigating a high-stakes psychological war with a man carved from glacial ice. I was simply feeding oil to old wood, bringing warmth and color back to a forgotten surface. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. In the hushed aisles of that bookshop, I slowly began to find my sanctuary. I spent hours scrubbing, polishing, and breathing in the heavy, earthy scent of the linseed oil. With every pass of the rag, I felt the sterile, suffocating memory of the modern penthouse being scrubbed away from my own skin. Not because I was erasing Christian from my mind. His dark, commanding presence still echoed relentlessly in my thoughts, but because I was actively reclaiming my own agency. I was rebuilding my life from the splinters, one quiet, deliberate motion at a time, entirely on my own terms. While I was kneeling on the dusty floorboards of Clara's shop, finding my salvation in the rough texture of old pine, Christian was experiencing a profound and devastating unraveling. I did not know it then. I was far too focused on learning how to breathe again, without the suffocating weight of his expectations pressing down on my chest. But time eventually softens even the sharpest edges. Months later, in the quiet, absolute safety of a shared night, with the hearth fire burning low and his hand resting securely over mine, Christian would finally confess the exact anatomy of the silence I had left behind. His voice would be thick with memory, as he told me about the moment the heavy oak door clicked shut. He had stood perfectly still by the massive black marble kitchen island, his dark eyes locked on the unadorned platinum wedding band, resting exactly in the center of the black titanium credit card. He was a man who understood the world strictly through leverage, ultimatums, and corporate acquisitions. He had assumed, with the arrogant certainty of a man who had never lost a negotiation, that my departure was merely a tactical protest. He believed that the freezing rain, the absolute lack of funds, and the terror of poverty would break my resolve before I even reached the ground floor. He fully expected his phone to buzz with a hotel charge, a signal that I had surrendered to the safety of his wealth. He walked to the panoramic floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the rain-swept streets, waiting to see my figure turn back toward the glass tower. He waited for 10 minutes, then 20, then an hour. The notification never came. The realization that I was not coming back did not hit him like a sudden physical blow. It seeped into his bones slowly, deliberately, like the freezing dampness of a winter storm penetrating a cracked foundation. The next morning, for the first time in his ruthless, highly optimized professional career, Christian Vance did not go into the office. His personal assistant called repeatedly to remind him of a critical board meeting. He muted the phone and left him face down on the cold marble counter. The massive 2-story penthouse, which had always been a towering monument to his immense power and unyielding control, suddenly felt like a high-altitude tomb. The mechanical hum of the air conditioning, which usually sounded like efficiency, now sounded like a hollow death rattle. He wandered aimlessly through the sprawling, pristine corridors, his immaculate dark tailored suit feeling unusually heavy on his broad shoulders. He realized that the sterile luxury he had meticulously built around himself possessed absolutely no warmth. The brushed steel fixtures, the sprawling white marble floors, the expensive minimalist furniture, they were all incredibly loud in their emptiness. Without the quiet, defiant friction of my presence, without the soft clinking of my teacup, or the rustle of my turning pages, the penthouse was nothing more than a hollow, multi-million-dollar vault. Eventually, his aimless pacing brought him to the narrow, brightly lit hallway leading to the guest wing. He stopped in front of the closed door. He pushed it open, half expecting to catch the lingering scent of chamomile and cedarwood. The small guest bedroom was exactly as I had found it on my first day. Pristine, immaculate, and entirely devoid of human history. The heavy duvet on the bed was smoothed flat, as if no one had ever slept there. The floating glass shelf, where I had so carefully arranged my father's battered paperbacks, was completely bare, reflecting the gray, melancholic light of the storm outside. The building's aggressive air filtration system had already scrubbed away the faint, comforting scent of vanilla and salt air. Christian stepped into the center of the room, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. He had bought me to be a quiet, decorative shadow, and now he was entirely consumed by the absolute zero of my absence. He realized with a sickening clarity that he had chosen the superficial vanity of Victoria's high society approval over a woman who possessed actual, unyielding substance. As he turned to leave, his sharp gaze caught a tiny anomaly on the flawless white rug, just beside the glass nightstand. He walked over and knelt down. A titan of industry, a man who regularly decimated rival corporations without a second thought, knelt on the cold floor of an empty guest room. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the small object. It was a simple, hand-pressed flower bookmark. It must have slipped from the fragile, cracked pages of one of my books. when I was hastily packing in the dark. It was a meager, insignificant thing. A strip of rough, cheap, handmade paper with a faded, dried purple violet trapped between the fibers. The edges were fraying, completely unpolished, and entirely out of place in this temple of severe, calculated perfection. Christian held the bookmark in the palm of his large hand. He touched the rough, textured surface with his thumb, feeling the slight crumbling of the dried petals. Looking back, he would later confess to me, his voice low and heavy in the safety of a quiet room, that in that exact moment, the sheer gravity of his own arrogance finally crushed him. He looked at the handmade paper, and then he looked out the door toward the cavernous living room, where massive Baroque oil paintings and priceless sculptures sat in sterile isolation. He realized that this cheap, frayed piece of paper possessed more character, more raw human history, and more genuine soul than every single expensive artifact hanging on his walls combined. It was imperfect. It was fragile. And it was the only real thing that had ever existed inside his empire. He sat down on the very edge of the stiff, pristine mattress. He held the bookmark carefully, gently, as if it were spun from fragile glass. He was a billionaire, a man who commanded legions of employees and dictated the flow of global capital. Yet, as he sat alone in the crushing silence of the guest wing, he realized he was completely, utterly bankrupt. He had tried to purchase my dignity, to protect his family's vanity. He had used his vast wealth as a weapon to demand my compliance, and in doing so, he had systematically destroyed the only true sanctuary he had ever found. The silence in the penthouse was no longer just architectural. It had teeth. It was a vicious, echoing reminder of the quiet, unyielding woman who had calmly placed her wedding ring on the counter and walked away into the freezing rain, requiring absolutely nothing of his fortune. Christian Vance looked at the pressed violet, and for the first time in his life, he understood that leverage was entirely useless. He could not buy my return. He could not intimidate me into submission. If he wanted the quiet warmth that he had so carelessly driven away, he would have to do something he had never done before. He would have to completely, absolutely surrender his pride. 4 weeks had passed since the heavy oak door of the penthouse clicked shut behind me, sealing away the cold, sterile world I had briefly been forced to inhabit. The long train ride north had been a quiet blur of gray skies and rattling steel, methodically putting miles of frozen earth between my fragile peace and the crushing weight of his empire. In the city, time was measured in quarterly earnings, aggressive acquisitions, and the relentless, mechanical ticking of brushed steel clocks. But here, on the ragged edge of the New England coast, time was measured entirely by the shifting tides and the slow, steady turning of yellowed pages. I had settled into a deeply grounding routine. My mornings began in the dark kitchen of my weathered childhood home, where the drafty windows rattled against the coastal wind. I would boil water on the sputtering stove, meticulously brewing a cup of my familiar chamomile and cedarwood tea blend. Standing in the quiet shadows, I wrapped my hands around the chipped mug, feeling the residual phantom weight of the historical debts finally lifting from my shoulders. The suffocating reality of the marriage contract ledger was hundreds of miles away, locked in a world of cold marble and calculated transactions. For the first time in years, I was finally breathing actual, untainted air. By 8 o'clock each day, I was at Clara Miller's independent bookshop. The work was physically demanding, and paid barely enough to keep the lights on, but it offered a profound, unyielding sense of personal dignity. I spent my hours surrounded by towering, overcrowded stacks of classic literature, breathing in the thick, comforting scent of binding glue, dried lavender, and vanilla. There were no charity galas to navigate, no emerald-draped matriarchs to quietly battle, and no suffocating expectations to play the role of a compliant shadow. I belonged entirely to myself, actively rebuilding my life from the splinters. Clara was a perceptive, silent harbor of a woman who asked no intrusive questions. She simply handed me a ring of brass keys and trusted me to catalog the fragile shipments and restore the shop's fixtures, including a massive worn wooden bookshelf that required hours of careful oiling. The true test of my new sex sanctuary arrived in the middle of my second month on the coast, brought in by a massive, violent nor'easter. The storm did not arrive with a gentle warning. It slammed into the village with brutal, indiscriminate force, turning the sky the color of a bruised plum by early afternoon. The ocean thrashed against the rocky shoreline, sending freezing saltwater spray high into the air, while the relentless rain battered the brick facade of the bookshop. Clara had gone home early to secure her own property, leaving me alone to lock up the registers and finish cataloging a new shipment of 19th century poetry. I was standing behind the scarred checkout counter, a heavy woolen cardigan pulled tight around my shoulders to ward off the damp chill. The small brass bell above the door remained perfectly silent. No one in their right mind would brave the flooded, cobblestone streets in this weather. The only sound was the chaotic, deafening roar of the rain against the large front window, which was entirely fogged with thick, gray condensation. The cold draft crept under the door gap, biting at my ankles like shattered ice. I reached up with the sleeve of my sweater and wiped a small circular clearing on the glass. I peered out at the darkening street, checking to see if the rising, muddy water had reached the bottom of the wooden steps. The streetlights flickered intermittently, casting long, fractured shadows across the flooded pavement, and there, emerging slowly from the gray, chaotic blur of the violent storm, was a silhouette. My breath caught in my throat, freezing instantly in my lungs. It was Christian. He was not arriving in the back of an armored, temperature-controlled town car. There was no personal assistant, holding an oversized black umbrella over his head to shield him from the elements. He was walking completely unprotected through the freezing downpour, navigating the flooded cobblestones with heavy, deliberate steps. He looked nothing like the untouchable titan of industry who had sat across from me in that sterile boardroom. His immaculate, spoke dark suit, a garment worth more than the entire inventory of the bookshop, was completely ruined, plastered to his broad shoulders by the heavy, punishing rain. His dark hair was soaked, clinging to his forehead, and his usually precise, predatory stride was slow and exhausted. He looked like a man who had walked through 1,000 miles of shattered glass, just to reach this specific patch of flooded concrete. I did not retreat into the shadows of the stacks. I did not hide. I walked around the counter, my leather shoes tapping softly against the creaking floorboards, and approached the front of the shop. I gripped the heavy brass handle and pulled the door open. The bright, delightfully imperfect chime of the bell was instantly swallowed by the roaring wind. I stepped out onto the small, wooden overhang of the porch, the freezing mist immediately biting at my cheeks. Christian stopped walking. He stood exactly 10 feet away from me, remaining out in the open rain, refusing to step onto the sheltered wood of the porch without my permission. The water ran down his face as streams, dripping from his sharp jaw, completely soaking his collar. We stared at each other through the veil of the storm. The psychological canyon that had separated us in the penthouse seemed to have manifested physically in the flooded street between us. He did not look at me with the commanding, calculating arrogance of a man assessing a corporate asset. His dark eyes were completely stripped of their armor. They were raw, hollow, and filled with a desperate, heavy yearning that I had never seen before. Slowly his hand reached into the inside pocket of his ruined jacket. He withdrew a folded, waterlogged sheaf of heavy paper, the actual physical copy of the marriage contract that had once bound us in a cold transaction. He did not speak. His trembling, rain-slicked hands gripped the thick parchment. The paper was heavy, meant to last a lifetime. With a slow, agonizingly deliberate movement, he tore the contract completely in half. The sound of the thick pages ripping was visceral, yet swallowed entirely by the storm. He let the pieces fall from his fingers, watching the torn paper sink instantly into the freezing, muddy rain at his feet. The debt was gone. The leverage was permanently destroyed. Then, his hand reached into his other pocket. He withdrew his closed fist and held it out toward me, slowly opening his fingers. Resting in the center of his large, trembling palm was the hand-pressed flower bookmark. The rough, cheap paper was protected by his grip, the faded purple violet still trapped between the fibers. It was the only piece of me he had left, the tiny, insignificant object he had found in the absolute zero of my absence. I was wrong, Christian said. His voice was not the low, steady rumble of a boardroom conqueror. It was hoarse, fractured, barely carrying over the violent crashing of the ocean in the distance. He did not offer me a new contract. He did not offer to buy the bookshop, clear my remaining taxes, or drape me in heavy diamonds. He knew with absolute certainty that leveraging his wealth would only drive me further away. He took a ragged breath, the rain beating relentlessly against his broad chest. He didn't rush. He let the stillness stretch between us, heavy and absolute. And then, the man who had never lost a negotiation, the ruthless billionaire who commanded global empires and demanded absolute compliance, did the only thing he had left. He dropped to his knees. The impact of his knees hitting the rough, flooded concrete was a visceral, heavy thud. The freezing water instantly soaked into the fine wool of his trousers, staining the expensive fabric. He knelt there in the pouring rain, his head bowed, his broad shoulders shaking slightly against the biting cold. It was an act of profound, absolute surrender. He was mantling his own power, laying his immense pride on the wet pavement, offering me the one thing he had withheld since the day we signed the ledger, his complete vulnerability. I stood on the porch, my hands gripping the wooden railing, my heart pounding a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The contract made me his wife, but my courage made the ruthless billionaire kneel. The sheer gravity of the moment anchored me to the floorboards. I was not looking at a tyrant. I was looking at a terrified, broken man who had finally realized that a home built on leverage is nothing more than a beautifully decorated cage. He was finally acknowledging that my quiet dignity possessed infinitely more value than his sprawling corporate empire. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, the words carrying a devastating weight as he looked up at me from the flooded pavement. "Tell me you want nothing to do with me, Elizabeth, and I will walk back into the ocean. I will never disturb your peace again, but if there is even a fraction of a chance that you can forgive my arrogance, let me learn how to exist in your world. Let me earn you." The silence between us stretched, entirely unbroken by the roaring storm. I looked at the man kneeling in the freezing mud. I looked at the fragile pressed violet he guarded so fiercely in his massive hand. I did not feel the sting of victory. I did not feel a vindictive thrill at his humiliation. I only felt a deep, overwhelming wave of profound recognition. The glacial ice had finally shattered, revealing the desperate, fiercely devoted protector underneath. I let go of the wooden railing. I walked down the 2 short steps, stepping out from under the protective awning and directly into the freezing downpour. The rain instantly soaked my clothes, but I did not care. I walked over to where he knelt and stopped in front of him. I reached out, my trembling, cold fingers gently catching his jaw. The stubble on his skin was rough, his flesh freezing to the touch. "You are ruining a very expensive suit, Christian," I said softly, the first faint trace of warmth bleeding into my voice. He closed his eyes, leaning his heavy face into the palm of my hand, a long, shuddering sigh escaping his chest. "It means absolutely nothing," he replied, his voice breaking. "None of it means anything without you." "Get up," I told him quietly, my thumb tracing the sharp line of his cheekbone. "Come inside out of the cold." He did not force me to return to the city. He did not call his assistant to arrange a private car. When Christian Vance stepped over the threshold of the independent bookshop, he left his corporate empire outside in the rain. He stepped into my world, bringing only the wet, ruined clothes on his back and a quiet, unyielding determination to prove his devotion through silent action rather than capital. The transition was not a sudden, cinematic explosion of romance. It was a slow, deliberate thawing, measured in the quiet, tactile routines of our new reality. He rented a small, modest room at the local inn down the street, refusing to intrude on the sanctity of my childhood home until I was ready to invite him in. He spent his days sitting quietly in the corner of the bookshop, reading the battered paperbacks I recommended, learning the rhythm of my days without ever attempting to control them. 3 weeks after the storm, the true depth of his transformation crystallized on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The massive, worn wooden bookshelf in the back corner of the shop had developed a severe, dangerous lean. The old pine joints were separating, threatening to collapse under the weight of the heavy encyclopedias. In the past, Christian would have simply made a phone call, hired a team of elite contractors, and replaced the entire unit with custom-milled mahogany before I could even blink. But he didn't. Instead, he arrived at the shop wearing a simple, faded cotton shirt and a pair of worn denim jeans. He walked straight to the back corner, carrying a heavy, rusted metal toolbox he had borrowed from the local hardware store. He did not say a word. He simply knelt on the dusty floorboards exactly as he had knelt in the rain and went to work. I stood behind the checkout counter, watching him in absolute silence. He rolled his sleeves up to his elbows, revealing the corded muscles of his forearms. He reached into the toolbox and pulled out a simple, wooden-handled hammer and a handful of steel nails. He assessed the structural integrity of the old pine with the same intense, terrifying focus he used to apply to hostile corporate takeovers. He aligned the heavy wooden joints with his bare hands, driving the nails in with precise, measured strikes. The sharp, rhythmic sound of the metal hammer hitting the wood echoed through the quiet shop, a steady heartbeat of physical, manual devotion. He was sweating. His knuckles were scuffed, covered in a fine layer of sawdust and old dirt. He was building my sanctuary with his own hands. I walked into the small break room in the back and filled the electric kettle. I waited for the sharp click of the boiling water, then poured it over the dried leaves, carefully brewing 2 cups of our familiar chamomile and cedarwood tea blend. The fragrant, earthy steam rose into the air, completely erasing the smell of the damp storm that had haunted the coastal town. I carried the 2 chipped ceramic mugs back into the main shop. Christian had finished bracing the shelf. He was standing back, wiping his brow with the back of his dirty wrist, inspecting his work. Resting on the scarred surface of the wooden checkout counter, completely abandoned, was his heavy black titanium luxury watch. He had taken it off to avoid scratching the wood, and a fine dusting of pine sawdust had settled over the expensive glass face. It sat there, a multi-million-dollar piece of machinery, looking entirely useless next to the raw, honest labor he had just performed. I walked over and placed one of the steaming mugs directly beside the titanium watch. Christian turned at the soft clink of the ceramic. He looked at the hot tea, the steam curling upward into the dim vanilla-scented air. He did not reach for his watch. He reached for the chipped mug. He wrapped his large, calloused, dirt-stained hands around the warm ceramic, closing his eyes as the scent of the cedarwood hit him. The rigid, unyielding tension that had defined his shoulders for his entire life was completely gone. He looked peaceful. He looked entirely human. He opened his eyes and looked at me across the narrow, dusty aisle. The silence between us no longer had teeth. It was soft, protective, and deeply warm. It was the silence of 2 heavily armored souls who had finally laid down their weapons. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I did not speak. I simply leaned forward and rested my forehead against the center of his chest. His heart beat steadily beneath the faded cotton of his shirt, strong and incredibly real. He let out a long, shaky breath, carefully wrapping his free arm around my shoulders, pulling me firmly against him. He held me as if I were the most precious, fragile thing in the world, burying his face in my hair. Somewhere in the back of the shop, the old grandfather clock ticked in a slow, steady rhythm. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping philosophical promises. There was only the warmth of his skin, the quiet ticking of the clock, and the scent of cedarwood and old paper slowly fading into the peaceful silence of the shop. If this quiet journey through the storm brought a sense of peace to your evening, take a slow breath, leave a like on this video, and subscribe to our channel. Sit with us again, because there is always another quiet room waiting to be found.